unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's still relevant.
I think it's
Yeah,
completely
new
relevant.
things come up.
How's old your youngest?
2.
Is there one in the middle?
Yes, 3.
I feel you.
Yeah, the 17 months apart was rough.
That's rough.
Yeah.
I didn't. We weren't there. We were 20 months, but that's rough.
Yeah.
Still diapers or no?
The youngest one's still in diapers. The middle one just got her out of diapers.
Great.
Yeah. Yes, there's like a gap between 6
Milestone.
and 3 and 2. Yeah, yeah.
Car, diapers.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
I love it.
Preteen years scare me the most.
They are scary.
I
I'm not
feel like
gonna
I'm
lie.
locking them up for a few years.
And you've got really good kids.
I mean, there's still always issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Amanda, you'll give me the thumbs up? Oh, we're good to go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Loud for Cone Chapel. Thank you so much for attending this evening. Welcome to everyone who's in person, and welcome to everyone watching online. We're streaming this conversation, and it will also be recorded. So as many of you know, February 16th opened a landmark decision in which the Alabama Supreme Court issued a ruling that embryos created through in vitro fertilization, IVF, should be considered children. According to Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, several of the state's IVF clinics have since paused services, and lawmakers, doctors, and patients are raising concerns about the far-ranging impacts of the ruling on healthcare, including reproductive technology. There was an article on February 19th in the Washington Post that said the following: the Alabama case focused on whether a patient who mistakenly dropped or destroyed other couples' frozen embryos could be held liable in a wrongful death lawsuit. The court ruled that the patient could, writing that it had long held that unborn children are children, and that was also true for frozen embryos, affording the fertilized eggs the same protection as babies under the wrongful death of a minor act. They said it applies to all children born and unborn without limitation, the court wrote. It's not the role of this court to craft a new limitation based on our own view of what is or is not wise public policy. That's especially true whereas here the people of this state have adopted a constitutional amendment directly aimed at stopping courts from excluding unborn life from legal protection. So when this came out, we were saying a month ago or so, I was glued to the newspaper articles, I was glued to the internet, to the television, and to my many, many emails that I received primarily from congregants who are or have been intimately involved in the IVF process. And I began to wonder a few things in terms of our response. I wanted Sinai Temple and the greater Jewish world to hear from a Jewish medical ethicist who can thoughtfully and reliably speak about Jewish medical ethics and the status of embryos in terms of life, as you heard, from a Jewish lens. And I also wanted to invite an IVF specialist to speak to our congregation and the greater world and inform us of the real-time and real-life ramifications of this kind of ruling and how this impacts all of us, and in particular, reproductive rights. That led us to this evening. And so it's my honor to introduce you. First of all, I'm Rabbi Nicole Guzik. I'm one of the senior rabbis here at Sinai Temple. And it's my honor to introduce you to Rabbi Jason Weiner. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, and to Dr. Sahar Wertheimer. I'm going to share their bios because I think these two are incredible people, and you deserve to hear about their accolades and their experience. Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner serves as the senior rabbi and director of the spiritual care department at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, where he is responsible for the chaplaincy team and all aspects of spiritual care. Rabbi Weiner previously served as the assistant rabbi at Young Israel of Century City. He's earned 2 rabbinic ordinations, as well as a doctorate in clinical bioethics from Loyola University, where he also earned a master's degree in bioethics and health policy, in addition to a master's degree in Jewish history from Yeshiva University. He's completed 4 units of clinical pastoral education. He's board certified as a chaplain through Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains, and he sits on the association's board. Rabbi Weiner is a member of the executive committee of the Cedars-Sinai Bioethics Committee, and he's the author of Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision-Making and Guide to Observance of Jewish Law in a Hospital. Let's give a round of applause for Rabbi Weiner. And we welcome Dr. Sahar Wertheimer to Sinai Temple. Dr. Wertheimer is an esteemed obstetrician and gynecologist who possesses a multifaceted approach to her medical practice. She's fluent in English, Hebrew, and conversational in Farsi, and she prioritizes providing the highest quality of care to all her patients while supporting their fertility journey with the utmost respect and compassion. Driven by her passion for educating women on their reproductive health, she goes above and beyond her clinical responsibilities. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Wertheimer serves as the chair of the Women's Health Committee for the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. In the past, she established a monthly webinar broadcast that tackles various women's health topics, attracting an audience of over 2,000 live viewers. Through these initiatives, she strives to empower women with knowledge and enable them to make informed decisions about their health. Her expertise in the areas, some of them include advancing the field of reproductive medicine. It's evident through her dedicated research efforts. Her focus lies in genomics research, I'm sure I said that wrong, particularly exploring the epigenetics of the placenta, as well as identifying markers of androgen excess and polycystic ovary syndrome and hirsutism.
Doing great.
I am? Okay. Rabbinical school, not medical school. Her expertise in these areas has led her to author and co-author publications that cover a wide range of reproductive and prenatal-related topics. With her unwavering dedication and contributions, Dr. Sahar Wertheimer continues to make a lasting impact in the field of obstetrics and gynecology. So I'm just so proud to have her here as well at Sinai Temple. And I'd love to ask both of our speakers just to share for a few minutes. I'm going to move this out of the way. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. So if you'll each just share for a few more minutes a little bit more about your training, what inspired you to take this particular journey and this particular route in your life.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rabbi Guzik. It's an honor to be here with you and with Dr. Wertheimer. I'm a big fan of your synagogue and your leadership here, and it's great to be here with you. as was mentioned, I did not intend in going to rabbinical school to specialize in medical ethics or work in a hospital, but I found myself at Cedars-Sinai 17 years ago, and I wanted to be able to be a resource to people. And the more I learned, the more I realized that Jewish tradition and Jewish values have a lot to offer to people who are making complicated and difficult decisions. And I saw how much people were struggling to make decisions in the hospital because it's so challenging. There's so many things we never imagined before, and people oftentimes look to their tradition for guidance in making these decisions. And so I decided to really delve deeply into Jewish tradition to be able to be a resource for people in these moments.
I ended up in my field because there's no better field. I think it's just that simple. We get to help women get pregnant and live out their dreams, and it's really that simple. When it comes to the topic of the embryos, it obviously hits close to home because that's my job, but also because on a personal level, I've had my own kind of journey. I had a medical termination at 13 weeks for a fetus with a neural tube defect. And I remember very vividly when I was a resident in OBGYN in the Bronx, I was kind of like the token Jew, and everyone just assumed I'd be like anti-abortion and were always trying to like debate me. And the truth is I was confused by it because in Jewish law, and Rabbi Weiner could speak a little bit better about that, when there is a medical indication for an abortion, it's really not so complicated. And I found myself, personally living that out just a few years later. And so I think that there can sometimes be this gap of knowledge, whether it's amongst Jews who think that there's no way that they're going to be allowed to get a termination heter from their rabbis, or if it's amongst non-Jews who think that we're automatically against it. And so this topic has kind of become an extension of the conversation of where does life begin and everything like that. So
We're just getting a request to speak closer to the mics.
Yes.
And so it might be a little bit loud here, but it sounds like this might be soft online.
this out.
Yes, okay. So it leads us perfectly into the conversation in both of your fields. Okay, so first in the field of Jewish medical ethics, and then in terms of medical definitions, how would you each define an embryo?
Okay. So I'm going to try to be brief tonight, but this just might take a minute. Okay. So there is a lot. And I not think I'm sharing my personal opinion here. I think I'm just going to try to reflect what Jewish tradition teaches about the status of an embryo. We know, as Dr. Wertheimer mentioned, that Jewish law permits abortion in many circumstances. In one place, the Talmud mentions that if there's a situation where a fetus is causing risk to the life of the mother, that the fetus may be aborted. It actually refers to cutting it up, sort of like a DNC, what we'd have today, and that's what the Talmud allows that. And it says because it's not yet a soul. The commentaries say it does, because we talk about when does it have a soul? This ends up being part of the big debate in different religious communities. And the commentaries actually say that it does not have a status, the fetus, of a human being until Rosho Verubo, the head and majority of the body, has been birthed. So the whole time that it is a fetus, it doesn't have the same status as the mother. That's why it's permissible to end the fetus's life, so to speak, for the sake of the mother's life, because the mother's life has status of a full human, whereas a fetus does not yet have a status as this equal status to a human being. But what's interesting is that it's still a little more complicated than that, which is that one question that might come up is, if we're saying that it does not have a status of a human being, the fetus, does that mean it has no status whatsoever? Is it nothing? And one of the ways we often determine this in Jewish law is, what are we allowed to violate the Sabbath for? What rises to the level of importance that we can violate the Sabbath in order to save it? We know to save a life, we can do anything on Shabbat. You can do whatever it takes. You can violate the Sabbath to save a life. The reason we say that is because the Torah has a verse which says, V'chai behem, you shall live by them. We have to live by the mitzvot, by the commandments, and therefore, even if it means violating a commandment, to live, it's worth it. So normally, if let's say a fetus is in danger, we say we do whatever it takes to save that life, even if it's the Sabbath. But does that mean that it has the same status then as a living adult? I mean, we save life, but I thought it doesn't have the same status. So interestingly, the rabbis said that is only true, the v'chai behem, we save life for an adult, not for a fetus. For a fetus, there's a different reason. We are still allowed to violate the Sabbath, to save the life, but it's a different reason. The reason there is because the Talmud has a principle. The principle goes like this: Chalel alav Shabbat echat kadei sheyishmeru Shabbatot harbei. You can violate one Sabbath so that you can observe many more in the future. Sometimes you can break Shabbat in order to be able to live to observe more. In other words, it gives the fetus sort of the status of potential life. We can break the Sabbath to save its life because it will one day be a living person who can then observe the Sabbath. Okay, but it's still one more issue. And I'll tell it with a brief case. This really happened in Israel. There was a case where there was a fertility clinic, and they have all these frozen embryos in the clinic. And one Shabbos, on the Sabbath, there was a power outage. Power outage, that's pretty important in a fertility clinic, right? They're frozen. So it's okay, there's a backup generator. But the backup generator, this was in an Orthodox neighborhood in Bnei Brak in Israel. They ran to the rabbi's house. His name was Rabbi Vosner, one of the Hasidic rabbis. They ran to his house and they said, Rabbi, we have a power outage. Can we turn on the backup generator in the clinic to save the embryos' lives? Now, when he was asked this question, he realized this is not a simple question, because he realized if I say yes, violate the Sabbath to save the life of the embryos, I am therefore saying, he realized in his head, that all sorts of fertility treatments, whether it's IVF or stem cell research or PGD, we'll talk about what all these words mean, that's not allowed because I'm now giving them the status of a life. So he realized this is a problem if I say it's allowed. And then there's one last concept. I promise I'm going to wrap. I'll conclude my point. I'll bring it all together. There is one more issue. There's another quote in the Talmud that says as follows. This is from the Torah in Parshat Noach. It says, Hashofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. One who kills a person, another person can kill them. The Torah allows capital punishment. The rabbis severely limited it. But there is a verse in the Torah which says capital punishment's allowed. One who kills a person, meaning the court, is allowed to kill them. But it's worded funny. Hashofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. That's a lot of Adams, right? So they said, why does it say Hashofech dam ha'adam ba'adam? What does it mean? What's a person in a person? Adam ba'adam. In other words, the rabbis move the comma over one word. So it says if you shed the blood of a person in a person. So the rabbi said, oh, that's talking about a fetus in its mother's womb. And there was initially a prohibition against abortion, but then we see there's many times, as I mentioned at the outset, when the rabbi said actually it could be permissible in many cases. So this rabbi thought, he said, wait a second, an embryo that's not in a womb, meaning it's in a fertility clinic, that does not have a status. That does not violate one Shabbat, so you can observe many Shabbats. That doesn't have a status. So therefore, you can't violate the Sabbath for the clinic. Now, this can make other people upset because they could say,
wow,
wait a second, there's a lot of issues there. So he says, okay, I have a solution. It might be a challenge in Bnei Brak, but someone who's not Jewish will be allowed to turn it on. Okay. So in other words, we could find a way to make sure it gets turned on, but we have to also say it's not allowed so that we can say that it doesn't have the status. So this was the way the legal ruling, the legal language works in Jewish law, that we say an embryo outside of the womb does not have the status of a life or even a potential life. And therefore, unlike the Alabama court, which said that basically it's the same as the fertility clinic as a daycare center and that you can have a wrongful death for killing an embryo, the rabbi said, nope, embryo does not have status of a life whatsoever, even though once it's growing and it's in a fetus, it is a potential life, but it's still not the same status of a human. And this is how the legal ruling, the legal reasoning worked amongst the rabbis, and that's been going back for a long time. It's interesting, I'll just close with this. All this, what I've been saying, is going back over 1,000 years. The Bahag, one of the Gaonim, 1,000 years ago, who originally wrote this, that an embryo doesn't have status, he writes, an embryo doesn't have a status of a human life. But when would we ever have a situation when an embryo is not in a womb? So it doesn't make sense to even talk about this. It's all academic. And he ends and he just says, so why are we wasting our time talking about this? 1,000 years later, it's very relevant. Yeah.
So I want to know if the backup generator was turned on or not. Did they find
Yes.
a non-Jew?
They found someone to turn on the generator.
Just thinking about those precious embryos. So in medicine, the definition of an embryo is much simpler. There is an egg, which is, the gamete or the reproductive cell of the female body, and then there's sperm, which is the reproductive cell of the male body. And once fertilized, they start to divide into a group of cells, which further divides until it starts the process of embryogenesis and turns into a fetus. So an embryo is that group of cells that is a fertilized egg, essentially.
And just to follow up on kind of the conversation that Rabbi Weiner was saying, potential versus life versus no status.
Yeah.
What would you say?
So I would say that embryos are potential of life. They are not life. And I would say that nobody knows that better than a woman who has gone through IVF. She wants more than anybody else in the universe for each of those embryos to equal a child, and they don't. There is a funnel in IVF where the amount of eggs that we start with does not equal the chances of having children that we're going to have. And should I explain that further now? Or
Please.
Okay. So basically, in the process of IVF, we try to stimulate. There is a background vault of eggs that we all have that we're born with. We're born with about 1 to 2 million eggs. By the time we're in menopause, it's in the thousands. So we're continuously losing eggs throughout our entire life. And it's not just one egg every month, as many people would think, but rather a whole group. A group comes to the front of the ovary. They're all competing to be the egg that you're going to ovulate that month. Whether or not you get pregnant with that egg, the background amount of eggs get lost that cycle regardless. And so what I tell women is when we look on the ultrasound and we look at your ovaries and we count how many eggs came to the front this month, that does not equal how many potential children you're going to have. But rather we try to stimulate you to rescue those eggs that you are going to be losing this month, try and get as many as possible. We take them out in a procedure. We then fertilize them with sperm, and then we watch them divide over the next few days. So I would say probably 70% of our eggs fertilize. 50% of those fertilized eggs make it to the blastocyst stage, which is about a day 5, day 6, day 7 embryo, where the cells that become the placenta have separated from the inner cell mass that's going to become the fetus. And then we these days it's pretty standard that we biopsy those cells that will later become the placenta, called the trophectoderm, to see what the genetic makeup is of that embryo. Is it a healthy embryo, or is it an embryo with extra DNA or decreased DNA that's not going to result in a healthy child? And the amount of embryos that come back normal depends on the mother's age at the time that we did the retrieval. So, for example, in a 35-year-old, 50% of your eggs are probably normal, 50% are not normal. If we're lucky enough to get 4 embryos, probably 2 of those embryos will end up being normal. And out of those once we have a normal embryo, there's a 60-70% chance that it's going to implant when we transfer it back to the woman. And so there's a 30 to 40% chance it won't work. And that is the IVF funnel. So not every embryo will end up equaling a baby.
I'm curious for both of you. After this, ruling was enacted, who did you hear from? Did you hear from past congregants, current patients in the hospital? Who reached out to you? Maybe there were other peers that reached out to you in terms of your patients, both current and past. Who kind of, I don't know if it did happen or not, but flood your email boxes in terms of this conversation? Or was it just rabbis saying, we're concerned?
For me, so I get more correspondence with people through social media. So it was a lot of social media responses and DMs of people concerned. What does this mean? What does this
I'm
mean
sorry,
for
can
my-
I ask you another question too
Yes.
before that? Did you also, did either of you post any kind of response?
Yes.
I'm curious, what was that initial response?
Well, first I posted the news and what the concerns were, and then I actually did a live with a fertility lawyer who is not from Alabama, but and we just did a live where I asked some of my questions, and I was wondering if they were valid or not. And the short answer is that we really don't know. We don't know if we think it's probably not going to become at the federal level, but ultimately we don't know. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
Reached out to you.
So yeah, it was a lot of followers or a lot of patients asked us if their embryos were safe, if they had to kind of like move embryos in different directions. And, you know, we were luckily able to tell them that in California, this is really not going to affect you now and probably never. But yeah, there was just a lot of concern, a lot of people wanting to talk about it.
A lot of people asked me about it, both in the hospital and congregants. My initial response was that that week I gave a class on the topic and recorded it and posted it. I posted my classes on YU Torah. It's a repository of Torah lectures. And so I did a class that week. And a lot of what people were asking me was both. I had some people asking, like, is this gonna impact us in any way? People were surprised, you know, just like Rabbi Vosner, as I told the story of the fertility clinic that had the power outage, just like the way he was thinking, what are the ramifications 2 steps down the line of a lot of people were asking, like, oh, now I didn't think at the time of Dobbs or the time when Roe versus Wade was, you know, reversed, I didn't think of what the ramifications might be. What other ramifications should we be thinking about? Like, it just made people think about, like, what might happen as a result of different, whether it's political movements or just, you know, when laws change, and that impacts our lives. And people got concerned because, I mean, this had an immediate impact, and people are wondering, is this, you know, where else will this happen? Could this happen in California or in other states where many Jews live? So there were a lot of people asking about it and asking for a Jewish perspective on it.
And in terms of your own personal fears and concerns, what would you share?
So actually when the Dobbs ruling came out, there was a lot of the fertility doctors were already concerned with the thought process that where people define life can extend to conception or can extend beyond conception to embryos. And it was poo-pooed by some, it was taken seriously by others. And I actually remember going into, there was somewhere where you could go and you can kind of like read state by state who defined, and it's very unclear, and it still is actually very unclear. So it was kind of surprising that Alabama, and again, I'm no legal expert, but it was surprising, but not surprising that Alabama chose to interpret it that way. So the fears about IVF are, so just like I explained, there's a funnel, and the thought process that I had was that if they're going to say every embryo is a potential life, is a child, then are we going to be allowed to create multiple embryos to find that normal embryo, or are we now going to have to do this kind of like one by one? If we find an abnormal embryo, what's the status of that abnormal embryo? Is that a child with disabilities? Do we have to implant it? Does that woman have to then fail a transfer or miscarry in order to try another one? And that's just adding considerable, forget about the emotional roller coaster, but adding a considerable expense, because we save a lot of money by batching these embryos together and biopsying them together. And it's also adding a considerable factor which is of utmost importance in the fertility world, which is time. If we want to go through every single egg, fertilize it, biopsy it, try it, by the time we're done with a batch, how old is this woman going to be? Is she still going to have the same fertility window? And it extends a little bit more, like, can embryos be transferred out of the state? Can they be transferred? Like, is there now adoption rules? Like, I don't know. So interesting.
Mm-hmm. There's another interesting potential ramification of something that I was worrying about. There's a few couples that I'm working with right now, actually, who are undergoing PGD. PGD is when, let's say a couple, we encourage them as rabbis, and I'm sure Dr. Wertheimer in her profession, we encourage people to do genetic screening, especially before they get married, and especially before they have children. Unfortunately, sometimes when we encourage people to do genetic screening, they find out that someone that they're very much in love with is not a genetic match for them, but they're very much in love. And whereas there were times not so long ago where they didn't have many options, there are a lot more options today. And one example is PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where they can actually fertilize a number of embryos and then test each one in the lab to determine which one is healthy and appropriate to become pregnant with. And then the other ones are discarded. It has to work that way, meaning we wouldn't take the risk, like Dr. Wertheimer was mentioning, of someone, let's say they were Tay-Sachs carriers or something. We wouldn't say just get pregnant and take that risk. We're going to, by definition, have to discard some embryos. And that was an important option that we have now. And people started getting nervous. Like, some people got married knowing that this is how they're going to now have children. So all of a sudden, like, when we advise them, it's okay, you can still get married, but you're going to have children in this manner, but their whole life has been planned in that way. So a few people already expressed concern about that. Like, does this now also determine where they should live? Some people in the hospital are talking about, embryonic stem cell research also, for those of you who are interested in medical research. The thing is, stem cell researchers already figured out a workaround for stem cell research. This was a big controversial topic a number of years ago when this has come up in the past, when the idea that the soul, life begins at conception, and therefore stem cells even from an embryo, which can be used for great resources in medical research, but if that's a life, then that's a form of abortion. So there has been big fights over that in our country in the past. But researchers found a way to actually take adult stem cells and rewind them to the pluripotent stage as if they were embryonic, and then do the same research on life-saving techniques on stem cells as if they were embryonic, but they come from adults. So they found workarounds for some things, but other things there's no workaround. I don't know of a workaround for PGD where you have to. And even the rabbi said you should discard the embryos that you're not using because you don't want someone else to get pregnant from that embryo, and then you have children running around somewhere that you don't know that they're your children. So the rabbis actually said you should discard them if you're not using them, or use them for research. So
I just want to clarify something that you were talking about, which is that, so we can genetically biopsy these embryos for two different types of things. We actually call it PGT-A now, or PGT-M. So what I was referring to was PGT-A, where we test them for aneuploidy, which is whether they have a normal amount of chromosomes like me and you, 46 chromosomes, or if they are like an extra copy of a chromosome, like Down syndrome babies, for example. And then what the rabbi is talking about is PGT-M, which is looking for a specific single gene mutation that we know about ahead of time, where and I pretty much make all my couples get genetically screened. These days we're screening for over 400 genetic diseases that we may carry, but we're not affected by. But if both partners carry the same genetic mutation, they have a 25% chance of having a fetus with the actual manifestation of that mutation. And so that's also a really interesting question, because whereas we in the scientific world at least think of aneuploidy as being a little bit more black and white, like this is, we do have some of these embryos that are compatible with life, like I mentioned, the Down syndrome children, but there are a lot of the aneuploidies are not compatible with life. They won't even implant. However, a genetic mutation like Tay-Sachs or Gaucher's in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, those are like, horrible diseases to have, and some of them die in utero and some of them die shortly after birth. And I wonder, I mean, I think that could be a really huge gray area. Are we gonna be allowed to test for these things? If we test for them, is that knowledge just to prepare the couple for what they're gonna have to deal with? Like what's the status then?
I wanted to pause to see if there's questions from our congregation or our audience. Please feel free. Go ahead. Oh, you know what I'm realizing is that the people at home, I'm going to try to repeat your question. Go ahead.
So for Rabbi, so you had mentioned that the status changes as the embryo or the egg is inside the female. At what point is it harmful for the woman's physical life or emotional or economic? Like, does that matter in terms of if she were to get an abortion?
So you're asking about the kind of emotional, physical, mental, spiritual care of the woman in terms of getting an abortion.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
And the Jewish lens that speaks to that.
in Jewish law, we say that a fetus does not have the same status of life as a person who's been born. And so therefore, the mother's life has precedent over the fetus's life, even though it's a potential life and we want to value it, of course, but the mother's life takes precedence. So much so, in fact, that yes, of course, if it's endangering the mother's life physically or emotionally severely, that Jewish law then justifies terminating pregnancy in order to save the mother's life. But sometimes, and in fact, personally, in my experience, what I get asked the most common in terms of abortion types of questions is it's only a secondary risk for the mother's life. Let's say, for example, God forbid, someone is pregnant. Let's say she's 4 months pregnant and it gets diagnosed, God forbid, with a horrible cancer. And the doctor says, you need to start chemo right away. But we will not give you chemo while you're pregnant because this is too risky for the fetus. So to save your life, we need to terminate the pregnancy. Now, that fetus is not risking the mother's life directly, meaning her life isn't at risk because of the fetus. Her life is just at risk because she can't start the chemo and the fetus is in the way of her starting the chemo. And even then, the rabbis say that that's still to save her life, and therefore that could justify an abortion. And some rabbis even say not just justify abortion, maybe even require it.
This is fascinating and layered and nuanced. And the Jewish law is very clear about when life starts and at what point with the baby's head and the shoulders. So at what point would this law start to maybe infringe on religious discrimination? If the Jewish law feels that this is one way and, Catholic or Christian or Muslim or Hindu thinks something different, at what point can you as a Jewish person say, but you're making me do this? This is discrimination because this is infringing on my religious beliefs. At what point does that intersect with this law?
So the question is, if Jewish law is clear that an embryo does not have the same status as life, at what point does this law or future laws infringe on or kind of equal the status of religious discrimination against the Jewish people?
Right. It's a great question. I think this will lead to lots of debates amongst legal scholars. To me, it does sound like it would be an infringement on my religious rights because I want to be able to practice my religion. I have my own religious perspectives, and there's things that I do and don't do because of my religion. But that's personally, and I'm not talking politics here, but that is why I like living in California, to be honest, because everything's pretty much allowed, and we can make our decision in what we want to do and not do, for the most part. And I think about it in the hospital at Cedars-Sinai. From the whole gamut of life, whether it's gender affirmation surgeries or end-of-life options and physician aid in dying or pregnancy termination, people can have different opinions about that. Everyone, I'm sure, in this room, I'm sure we have people can have very strong opinions. So our perspective is it's allowed, and you can decide with your own community what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And I think that Judaism, from my perspective, benefits the most when the government simply says, we're going to let you practice how you want to practice, and your community can decide what's moral to you and what's immoral to you. And there will be some things that you'll say are immoral, but we're going to let you have the space to make those decisions. I know that some people will argue that society has an interest in valuing life. And if we belittle the value on life, that has a negative impact. I get the argument. I think that it's the place of religious leaders and others to make the case through the power of moral influence, meaning being persuasive and convincing and compelling, rather than the law to force us to have to abide by. Especially, it's oftentimes certain religions, and I'm not trying to be. I'm not referring to anyone in particular. I'm just saying sometimes certain religious values take over the legal perspective, and I think that we're better off as a society allowing different groups to govern themselves rather than having the government tell us what's moral and what's immoral.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I often wonder if we might have a case that will take it in that direction. I've discussed it with my husband. He's a lawyer as well. And we come up with these scenarios. Like, for example, in my case, when I had a termination, I consulted with my rabbi in New York. And, he did some research. He wanted to understand, what kind of neural tube defect is this? And ultimately, I was allowed. And I must tell you that 2 days where I was waiting for him to get back to me were hell. Total hell. And I actually was taking my oral boards in Florida for OBGYNs. That's like a really big, in Texas for OBGYNs. That's like a huge deal. And I found out on Tuesday, my flight was Wednesday, my test was Thursday. I took it 13 weeks pregnant, knowing that I'm going to be terminating this fetus. And it was horrible. But imagine if you're living somewhere like Florida, where you can't, your rabbi told you can, and your state is telling you can't. And that actually did happen to a friend of mine. She was 25 weeks pregnant, so it was a little bit more complicated with really bad anomalies. And it actually got that far because she was praying that the anomalies were going to miraculously disappear. So she was really giving it a chance. And ultimately her doctors told her, like, this is bad. And she had to fly to New York to get her termination. So there are some people, I think, that have a little bit of a doubt that if it really gets to that point that they're really going to have to go, and it's happening. We're seeing that happen. Yeah.
Follow-up comment on the fertility clinic that lost power. I'm an attorney, and I saw a Court of Appeal opinion last year. A mother lost her eggs at the fertility clinic that lost power. She sued the fertility clinic. The case was in San Diego. She lost. She filed an appeal, and the Court of Appeal ruled in the favor of the fertility clinic.
I mean, I think we probably have it in our consents that there are some things that are beyond our control. So even if power is lost, most fertility clinics, I think, we're required even to have a backup generator. There's a lot of laws regarding what we need to have, what kind of alarms need to go off if the temperature drops even 1 degree, how much time the alarms have to give us of a warning. There's so many things in place. If all those things happen and then the embryos, get lost, I mean, you're not God, I think. So it's really unfortunate. It is. What I want to know in this case is it's kind of like a sketchy beginning to the case, right? Some man gets access to these embryos. That's my husband. Oh. And then drops the embryos, and the embryo, like, how did he get access? I mean, our embryos are under like lock and key security cameras, like barcodes. That part has not been explained to me yet. I don't know if anyone has insight on that.
I wasn't calling on Ariel to answer. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any impact on cord blood from any of these cases.
That's interesting.
Okay, so the question is there any impact from this case or others that you know about? Or also, I'm curious about ethics involved in cord blood.
I guess that would fall under like stem cells, what you were talking about before. I can't really see it getting there because the stem cells don't have the potential one by itself to become an embryo.
Do they belong to the mother or do they belong to the child?
So who does the cord blood belong to, mother or child?
Cord blood is a mix of both. So you have blood flowing from the mother to the fetus via the placenta, and then the placenta connects to the fetus via the umbilical cord. So I guess it depends if it's arterial or venous. I don't know what legal status it would have.
Other questions? Please.
Very fascinating that such know-how and technology even exists, and majority of us are oblivious to it. But just wondering, how do you assess if an embryo does have mutation, or is it simply by observing through a telescope the tiny little embryo, or how do you do tests, and are they foolproof?
So I just want to repeat the question. So the question is, how do you assess the health of an embryo?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating that we have this technology. What we do is, I don't do it, the embryologists do it, but we take the embryos under a microscope. And like I said, at that point in day 5, day 6, day 7, the cells that are becoming the placenta, day 5, 6, or 7. So within the last few days of the first week of life, they should have reached a stage called a blastocyst, where the cells that become the placenta have separated from the inner cell mass. We can then use a laser to open up basically the shell of the embryo and take some cells out using micromanipulation under a microscope and remove a few cells. And then those cells are sent to a lab that amplifies the DNA, and then looks at the DNA and analyzes it that way. So it's pretty cool. Yeah. We used to biopsy earlier in the embryo's life, and those cells, because the thought process is that the cells earlier on are kind of have more potential. They can become the placenta, they can become an organ, and we found less harm to the embryos if we biopsied those placental cells. But that being said, the placenta does not become the baby. And so while the cells that become the placenta mirror the genetic makeup of the baby, sometimes it's not the same. We have something called mosaic embryos, where we get more than one cell line from the placenta, and we're seeing different chromosomal makeups, and that becomes its own kind of complicated topic. And we know that our PGT analysis is only about 98% accurate, so there are some mistakes. Yeah, so rarely we can have very expensive and very involved. Yes. So maybe there should be insurance for creating embryos if they are alive.
Wow.
Maybe. I saw a funny meme that somebody posted saying maybe everybody in Alabama should claim their embryos as their tax dependents.
Right, yeah. I have a few more questions myself. I don't know if there's other questions, so please.
Do you know if there are any other states that may be following Alabama's lead in this matter?
Have we heard of other states possibly following Alabama's lead in this matter?
I haven't heard of any.
I don't know. I read that there were some that were discussing it, but I don't know how far along they are, if it's likely to happen or.
And my understanding also is, and again, I was hoping to ask I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding was that the senator in Alabama passed some sort of ruling that protected IVF. What I recently read so I feel like they kind of realized there's a problem that can quickly balloon.
Well, as you're saying, the tax paying, and yes, exactly. Please.
We're talking about the biopsy of the embryo. My understanding is there's a 1 to 2% chance of damaging that blastocyst, right? Even with a skilled embryologist. And so, I guess, anecdotally interesting of what liability there would be in Alabama.
Exactly.
Embryologist. But my question is actually a little more technical. It's just, if you want to speak to that, but I was just curious, does that embryologist know when they've damaged an embryo, or is there a risk of implanting something damaged? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question was that there's about a 1 to 2% risk of damaging the embryo. I'm actually not familiar with that exact percentage. That's what you were quoted by your doctor. And then the question was if the embryologist can realize that they damaged the embryo and implant a damaged embryo. In terms of what I was saying before, are we even going to be allowed to genetically biopsy? That's exactly what I was speaking to. Like, is that liability, basically? In terms of whether the embryologist can tell, I would imagine that in some, again, I don't do this every day. I've been in the lab, I've watched them do it. I imagine that if it's really obvious, they can tell. But I also think that when they're saying that they damaged the embryo, it means that that biopsy was just not good for that embryo, even if it was done correctly. That we know that IVF has some higher risks than spontaneous pregnancies. And we think some of it has to do with growing the embryos in culture. We think some of it has to do with biopsying the embryos, because we do see slightly higher risks in embryos that have been PGT tested versus not. And so the thought process is maybe that's just affecting some part of the placentation, and that maybe can cause a lot of these things are just beyond the level of detection.
By the way, I'll just point out something interesting in just now speaking from my bioethics perspective, not necessarily Jewish, but we've been talking about how Alabama, their ruling in this case was that these people sued for wrongful death lawsuits, right, for having lost these embryos. There are some people, there are some times when, let's say, someone is born and there's a mistake made in the in the early stages where there was uncertainty about the health of the genetic health of the embryo that could have been detected, and a baby's born and the baby is not born healthy, and then they actually have wrongful life lawsuits, the opposite of wrongful death, because they regret having been born unhealthy when that could have been prevented through various, genetic screening techniques. So that it's like the opposite of what we're talking about, but just an interesting ramification also of some of these conversations.
Can't win.
No. Yeah, right.
That's why the OBGYN's malpractice so high.
Wrongful life is a thing. Yeah, wrongful life.
In Alabama or?
No, around the country. By the way, it's not just wrongful life because of mistakes with genetic screening, but I know of a case where a Jehovah's Witness had their life saved by receiving blood. They weren't conscious, but they had in their advance directive that they would not want blood. Wow. And when they woke up, having realized that their life was saved, they then sued that hospital that saved their life for wrongful life.
That's interesting because the Jehovah's Witnesses will get religious exemptions for like immunizations. So
right.
Is this something that could qualify under a religious exemption for, say, Jewish, for Judaism?
You would think it would be an extension, right?
Right.
Please.
For children that are born through IVF, when they become adults, what kind of numbers are out there? Like what percentage, or like how is their success in reproduction when they want to become parents? What do you know?
So is there any kind of correlation you're asking for those children who are born through IVF? What do we know anything about kind of their reproduction and those kind of statistics, if they have issues in the future with reproduction?
Yeah, I don't know
with
about
fertility.
I don't know about a statistic at large. I imagine that'd be hard to study and control for, but I would say it depends on the diagnosis. So some people are doing it for reasons like chromosomal abnormalities that led to recurrent miscarriages. That is possible to inherit and see in the next generation. Endometriosis could be genetic. That could be a reason why the daughter of a mother might have. I anecdotally do have a lot of patients whose mothers needed to do IVF or had infertility. So I would say probably yes. I just don't know the number.
The oldest baby born from IVF is only 45 years old right now, Nancy Brown, the first person born with IVF. I just know because she was born the same month as me, so I always remember. So it's still relatively young.
Yeah.
And that's the oldest. That was the first.
Yeah.
And does that person have kids?
I don't know.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But.
So.
Please.
I'm concerned about this whole subject as it relates to the present world of domestic politics. Part of the mantra of the pro-life group is that abortion is murder. Murder is a criminal term that relates to killing of a person. And it seems to me to be a conflict potential between the Jewish point of view and the civil point of view that's going to be facing us in November And I'm perplexed at how this point of view might result in a serious growth in the anti-Semitism that's going on now. If there's a further open discussion, a logic discussion of what the Jewish law is compared to the state laws and the policies that are being put forth by the pro-life people. And I'm wondering if the three of you might have some suggestions with regard to the political discussion that we're all going to be facing in the short term.
So if I can try to summarize that, if our civil laws end up being, in terms of this discussion, what is defined by a life, what defines a life, if our civil law is questionably different than our, or not questionably different, is different, arguably different from our Jewish lens, then could this further the anti-Semitism, amplify the anti-Semitism that we're already facing right now? And I'll be honest, I did not. It's already so bad. I did not imagine that this conversation could amplify the hate, the Jewish hate that we're already experiencing. Although I don't know if you want to.
I agree with Rabbi Guzik that we're experiencing such bad anti-Semitism that I don't. This will be a drop in the bucket, if anything. But something that I have noticed in my field, because my field is kind of overwhelmingly left and liberal, and because we care about pro-choice. And I have noticed in my field that these are the same voices that are very anti-Israel and very Israel is doing X, Y, Z. And it's confusing, because on one hand, you want to be pro-choice, but you also don't want to align yourself with the people that want you killed. And it's not an exaggeration. And I was actually just mentioning before that, right now what I'm seeing is a lot of my colleagues amplifying this certain organization that they're all sitting on the board of. And they are using this case to try and garner support and try and get people to make donations and join them, because they're trying to affect legislature when it comes to embryos. Sounds, nice enough. One of the people that sits on the board is actually a human rights activist lawyer. He is running for Congress in Illinois. His name is Qasim Rashid, and he is pretty anti-Israel. He advocates for the release of hostages, so he's a moderate voice, but he calls everything Israel's doing genocide, war crimes, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a voice all my colleagues are amplifying. And I've tried to tell people, like, at this point when we're facing existential threat, I care about embryos and I care about the policy surrounding embryos, but I'm still going to choose my life. So it's a really hard place to be in. And what I would encourage everybody to do is to do your own advocacy and check who you're amplifying. Just make sure you know who you're amplifying. Don't automatically align with somebody's views A to Z just because of one issue. It's a time, I think, where unfortunately we've amplified so many voices that have turned against us in other ways, and we just have to be, unfortunately, super careful. And very unfortunately, when you politicize women's health and women's reproductive rights, this is what ends up happening. I get a little spicy when it comes to Israel.
Others?
Just to repeat about the genetic testing mistakes that are made to allowing something to pass as embryonically normal, and it wasn't. Can you speak to that again and just repeat, please?
Yeah, so essentially we biopsy a few cells from the cells that become the placenta. So it doesn't reflect the cell makeup perfectly of the inner cell mass. In theory, they should be the same. It's all the same DNA. But because we're catching it at such an early stage, these DNA lines can go in different directions. And so when we biopsy the cells that later become the placenta, let's say we took for simplicity's sake, 4 cells. And 2 of the cells say this is abnormal. It's going to be an abnormal fetus. And 2 of the cells say, no, the DNA in our cells are normal. Now you have a 50-50. We can't call it completely aneuploid and we can't call it completely euploid. So we call those mosaic embryos. And that's a whole kind of topic in my field these days, because there is a thought process that, first of all, we could have gotten, like if we had gone 1 cell higher or 1 cell lower, maybe we would have gotten a different makeup and thought it was okay and implanted it and it would have been fine, or the opposite. It could have been miscarriage or whatever. So I simplified it a little bit, but essentially we basically rate the level of mosaicism. And if it's a low level mosaic, a lot of labs will allow you to implant that into the mother with counseling, a lot of counseling, because it could end up being abnormal and she might need to terminate it. But it's not our first choice to implant a mosaic embryo. We really want to find some totally euploid embryos.
You're wanting the highest quality embryo.
Right.
That's right. And that's accurate.
Is that a question or a comment?
Question.
Yes, it's pretty accurate. I mean, these are tests that amplify the DNA and look very closely, and the resolution is pretty good. It's not perfect, but the mosaicism is rated, and we know because our tests, when we look at the fetuses that are born compared to the embryos that are implanted, we have pretty good correlation. And recently, the mosaic embryos, it used to be none of the clinics would implant mosaic embryos because the thought process was they're abnormal. But we did have some studies saying that if you did implant a mosaic embryo, women ended up with normal babies. So how could that happen? And the thought process was maybe when you put these back in the uterus, they kind of self-correct. Now the data is kind of moving a little bit away from the self-correction theory and more into maybe we just had a mistake with the biopsy. Maybe we amplified the wrong thing. So it's still kind of in motion. We're still kind of figuring it out. But basically the movement has been to not throw away the mosaic embryos, and with a lot of counseling, maybe implant them if they're that woman's last choice.
And just my last comment would it be accurate to say that there's no such thing as a perfect embryo?
Probably.
The question is would it be accurate to say there's no such thing as a perfect embryo?
I think that's pretty accurate. I don't know at what level, but I mean, none of us are perfect. Nope. And so, and it's such a complicated and layered topic, but I also sometimes wonder if by selecting certain genes or by selecting out certain genes, we know that some genes can be linked to other things. And so maybe we're kind of creating a situation. There's this new thing on the horizon called polygenetic mutation. We look for polygenetic mutations. So I spoke about single gene mutations where it's just one gene to identify, but now it's on the market. You can look for things like diabetes or autism spectrum disorders, things that may have more than one gene involved, and it's scary because we don't know enough, I don't think, but we might be getting there soon.
So we're going to wrap up. I want to ask you both a final question, and then I just want to share something. For those who are here this evening, first of all, thank you so much for coming and for all of your attention, and those who are watching at home and who will watch later on the recording. Where can people get more information? Some more information, resources about IVF. Where do you want people to look? And I'm curious if you've written anything recently, if there's any True Vote that are coming out from you, or resources online from you or from others. If they want to recommend to others, yes, watch tonight's video and read here if you want to hear more about the Jewish medical ethical lens on embryos.
You first.
I didn't ask you before, so I'm sorry.
I do have a chapter in my book on the topic. We mentioned there's some great organizations like Yesh Tikva locally.
Say your book title again.
Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision Making.
I own one.
Oh, thanks. And there's great organizations like we'll mention that are doing a lot of great teaching. And a lot of resources out there.
Great, thank you.
I would say the American Society for Reproductive Medicine is probably going to be at the forefront of all these things and letting everyone know what the legislator and the advocacy looks like. I would have said Doctors for Fertility, but now you guys know I don't believe in that. I don't know if I named it, but I just did.
You did.
And I think other doctors on maybe on social media. I don't have like one good resource that I can think of right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should have said it from the beginning of the conversation, but first of all, we're so blessed to have the two of you in this conversation and being at the forefront of these topics of which what I should have said are incredibly sensitive and very triggering for many, whether you are going through a struggle of infertility yourself, if you are going through IVF, if this is something that is part of your life, has been part of your family's life or social circle, all of these issues are incredibly personal and we know impacting the greater community as a whole. So number one, for those who are part of the Sinai Temple community, if this is something that you are facing or if you are emotionally, as I said, triggered by this conversation and you want someone to speak with, I am available. We also have our Sinai Temple Mental Health Center. The director, Carolyn Hoffman, is available to speak with you. We really want our synagogue to be a place of safety and support. That's number one. And as Rabbi Weiner mentioned, there's an incredible resource called Yesh Tikva, meaning there is hope. And it was established to end the silence, meaning around Jewish infertility, and create a Jewish community of support. They have two primary goals: to provide free professional psychosocial services and resources to those struggling with infertility, number two, to raise awareness and sensitivity about infertility throughout the Jewish community. So Yesh Tikva, I'm sure they're on Instagram, Facebook, and of course have their own website. And I'm happy to connect you with their executive director if you'd like more information as well. I hope you'll join me in really giving a round of applause and thank you to our incredible speakers this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And with that, we conclude our program. Thank you everyone who attended in person and everyone watching online. Good night.